Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you are watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. The concrete walls of Pelican Bay State Prison rise from the Northern California fog like a fortress built to contain the worst of humanity. This is not a place of rehabilitation. This is a term for the living, a maximum security facility where the most violent criminals in the state spend 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. But even in isolation, something was growing. Something that would spread beyond these walls and terrorize an entire state. It started in 1989 in the Security Housing Unit, known simply as the SHU, for men locked in separate cells, began communicating through a network that prison officials didn't even know existed. They used kites, tiny notes folded and passed through impossible spaces, air vents, and even through corrupt guards who turned their eyes for the right price. The men were leaders of different Mexican mafia factions, bitter rivals on the outside. But inside Pelican Bay, they saw an opportunity. Their names were whispered with fear even among hardened criminals. Luis Huero Flores, a shot caller with eyes like black ice. Antonio Chuco Gillen, whose smile could charm a priest before he ordered your execution. Daniel Stork Perez, tall and calculating, a man who treated murder like a chess game. And the fourth, the most dangerous of them all, David D.C. Cervantes, a man who had orchestrated 13 hits from behind bars before he even turned 30. These four men had a vision. They would create something new, something more organized and more ruthless than any gang that had come before. They would call it Nuestra Familia, our family. And it would operate like a military organization with ranks, rules, and absolute loyalty enforced by blood. Detective Sarah Mendoza from the California Department of Corrections had been tracking unusual patterns for months. Bodies were showing up on the streets of Salinas, Fresno, and San Jose, all bearing the same signature, 3 precise stab wounds forming a triangle on the victim's chest. The victims were all former gang members who had tried to walk away from the life. The message was clear: you don't leave the family ever. But what disturbed Mendoza most was the precision. These weren't crimes of passion or street-level chaos. These were executions, carefully planned and flawlessly executed by soldiers who took orders from somewhere untraceable. She knew the orders were coming from inside Pelican Bay, but proving it was another matter entirely. Inside the prison, the organization was growing. New recruits were being identified, tested, and initiated through brutal rituals that left some dead and others forever changed. The leadership established a taxation system. Every illegal operation on the streets, from drug trafficking to extortion, would pay tribute to the generals behind bars. Those who refused were eliminated with surgical efficiency. Correctional Officer Marcus Williams noticed something during his rounds one October evening. The men in the SHU were too quiet. In his 15 years at Pelican Bay, he had learned that silence was more dangerous than noise. He reported his concerns to his supervisor, but nothing was done. Budget cuts had reduced staff, and tensions were high. Nobody wanted to rock the boat. 3 days later, a young inmate named Rafael Soto was found dead in his cell. The official report called it suicide. He had fashioned a noose from his bedsheet and hanged himself, but Mendoza wasn't convinced. Soto had been cooperating with investigators, providing information about the gang's communication methods. She requested an autopsy review. The medical examiner found something the initial report had missed: bruising on Soto's wrists and ankles, consistent with being restrained. Defensive wounds on his hands. This was no suicide. Someone had gotten to him inside one of the most secure prisons in America, and they had made it look like he had taken his own life. Mendoza knew she was onto something massive. This organization had reach, resources, and ruthlessness that defied everything she thought she knew about prison gangs. She began pulling files, cross-referencing murders on the outside with communications inside. A pattern emerged that made her blood run cold. She was staring at her computer screen at 2 in the morning when she found it. A connection so obvious she couldn't believe it had been missed. Every murder, every hit, every act of violence on the streets could be traced back to visits, phone calls, or mail correspondence with one of the 4 founding members at Pelican Bay. But when she opened the locked evidence room to retrieve the original kites that had been confiscated over the past year, what she found changed everything. The box was empty. Detective Sarah Mendoza stood frozen in the evidence room, staring at the empty box that should have contained dozens of confiscated kites, the handwritten messages that could prove the conspiracy she had been tracking for months. The evidence tag was still attached, the seal unbroken, but inside there was nothing. Someone with access, someone she worked with every day, had made those crucial documents disappear. She didn't report it immediately. Years of investigative work had taught her that when evidence vanishes from inside a secure facility, you trust no one. Instead, she made copies of everything she had left, stored them in 3 separate locations, and began investigating her own colleagues. Meanwhile, inside Pelican Bay, the organization was evolving. David D.C. Cervantes had developed a communication system so sophisticated that it took investigators years to fully understand it. He used his legal visits to pass encrypted messages to his attorney, a man named Richard Stoltz, who had slowly been corrupted by money and threats against his family. Stoltz would then relay these messages to street captains during seemingly innocent meetings at coffee shops throughout California's Central Valley. The orders were always simple but devastating. A name, a location, and a method. Within 72 hours, the target would be dead. The soldiers carrying out these hits were often young men barely out of their teens, desperate for belonging and willing to kill for respect they had never known. They called themselves Northerners, and they wore red to distinguish themselves from their rivals. But Cervantes and the other generals had a bigger vision. They began targeting not just gang rivals, but anyone who threatened their operation. Witnesses preparing to testify, police informants, even a district attorney's investigator who had gotten too close to uncovering their financial network. The bodies piled up, and with each death, the gang's reputation grew more fearsome. Marcus Williams, the correctional officer who had reported the strange silence weeks earlier, started noticing other irregularities. Mail was being delivered to certain inmates after it should have been screened. Contraband cell phones were making their way into cells despite multiple shakedowns. He began documenting everything in a personal journal he kept locked in his car. One night after his shift, Williams sat in his vehicle in the prison parking lot, reviewing his notes under the dim interior light. He didn't notice the black sedan that had followed him from the staff exit. He didn't see the 2 men approaching from both sides until his driver's side window exploded inward. They dragged him from the car, beat him unconscious, and left him with a message carved into his forearm with a razor blade. 3 letters that would haunt him forever. An F. L. Nustra familiar for life. Williams survived but refused to talk to investigators. Whatever they had told him during that attack had terrified him into silence. Mendoza visited him at the hospital, but he wouldn't even make eye contact. The message was clear. The gang's reach extended beyond prison walls, beyond the criminal underworld, and into the lives of those who were supposed to be untouchable. Detective Mendoza shifted her focus to the financial trail. Every criminal organization needs money, and money leaves traces. She partnered with an FBI agent named Thomas Chen, a financial crimes specialist who had been tracking Mexican mafia money laundering operations for years. Together, they began following the cash. What they discovered was staggering. The gang had established a sophisticated network of legitimate businesses, car washes, taco trucks, construction companies, and even a chain of laundromats, all used to clean drug money and extortion profits. The businesses were registered under the names of girlfriends, wives, and family members with no criminal records. On paper, everything looked legitimate. In reality, millions of dollars were flowing through these operations every year, and a percentage of every dollar went back to the generals at Pelican Bay. Chen managed to flip a bookkeeper named Maria Escobar, a woman who had been keeping records for one of the front companies. She was terrified but exhausted from living in fear. She provided them with ledgers, names, and transaction records that connected street-level dealers directly to the prison leadership. It was the break they needed, but the night before Maria was scheduled to enter witness protection, she called Mendoza in a panic. Someone had been watching her apartment. She had seen the same car circling her block 3 times. Mendoza dispatched a patrol unit immediately and told Maria to pack a bag. They would move her tonight. Ahead of schedule, the patrol unit arrived at Maria's apartment complex in East San Jose just after midnight. Officers Rodriguez and Patterson climbed the stairs to her second-floor unit and knocked on the door. No answer. Rodriguez tried the handle. The door swung open, unlocked. They found Maria in her bedroom, kneeling beside her bed as if she had been praying. A single gunshot wound to the back of her head. Professional, execution style, no shell casing left behind. On her bed, arranged carefully, were all the ledgers and documents she had been preparing to hand over. But every page had been burned, leaving only ash and the metal spiral bindings. Mendoza arrived at the scene 30 minutes later. She stood in that bedroom, surrounded by the smell of gun smoke and burned paper, and felt the full weight of what they were up against. This organization had eyes everywhere, moved with deadly efficiency, and eliminated threats before they could materialize into real danger. Chen pulled her aside as crime scene techs processed the apartment. He showed her something on his phone, security camera footage from a building across the street. A figure in dark clothing had entered the building at 11:15. The timestamp showed this was 45 minutes before patrol was even dispatched. Whoever had killed Maria knew they were coming for her. Someone had warned them. There was a leak, and it was close. Very close. Back at Pelican Bay, David Cervantes received news of Maria's death through a coded message delivered during a meeting with his attorney. He smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. The organization was working exactly as designed. Fear was their currency, and business was booming. But Detective Mendoza wasn't finished. She was angry now, and anger made her focused. She began building a parallel investigation, one that only she and Chen knew about. They used secure communications, met in random locations, and trusted absolutely no one else. They were getting close to something. They could feel it. The generals at Pelican Bay had made their organization nearly invisible, but nearly invisible wasn't the same as perfect, and then Chen found it. A phone number that appeared in multiple transactions, always as a reference code, never explained. He ran it through every database available. Nothing. But when he searched it as a prisoner identification number in the California corrections system, a name appeared that made everything suddenly, horrifyingly clear. The number belonged to a correctional captain at Pelican Bay, a man named Frank Delgado who had worked at the facility for 23 years. A man who had access to everything: evidence rooms, visitor logs, inmate communications, and staff schedules. A man who had been feeding information to the gang for over a decade. Mendoza and Chen stared at each other across the table in their secret meeting location, a storage unit in Oakland that Chen had rented under a fake name. They had found the source of the leak, but now they faced an even more dangerous question. If a captain was compromised, who else had been bought or threatened into cooperation? How deep did the corruption go? That night, Mendoza received an unmarked envelope slipped under her apartment door. Inside was a single photograph. It showed her niece, 8-year-old Sophia, leaving school that afternoon. On the back, written in precise block letters, was a message that stopped her heart. "We know where she goes every day. Drop the investigation, or she disappears." Detective Sarah Mendoza sat at her kitchen table, the photograph of her niece trembling in her hands. Sophia's innocent smile stared back at her, frozen in a moment that had been weaponized as a threat. For the first time in her 15-year career, Mendoza felt true fear, not for herself, but for the little girl who had no idea she had become a pawn in a deadly game. She called Agent Chen at 3 in the morning. They met an hour later at a diner off Interstate 5, the kind of place where truckers stopped for coffee and nobody asked questions. Mendoza showed him the photograph. Chen's jaw tightened. He had a daughter too, and he understood exactly what this meant. The gang wasn't just threatening them anymore. They were targeting family. But instead of backing down, they made a decision that would either end the organization or end their careers. They would go around everyone. No more official channels, no more reports through the chain of command. They would build their case in absolute secrecy and then deliver it directly to the U.S. Attorney's Office with enough evidence that arrests would have to happen immediately. Before anyone could be warned, they had 2 weeks to pull it together. 2 weeks before Mendoza's sister was scheduled to take Sophia on a vacation to Disneyland, a trip that would keep them out of state and relatively safe. 2 weeks to take down an organization that had spent decades building an empire behind bars. Side Pelican Bay, David D.C. Cervantes was growing concerned. Communication with Captain Delgado had become sporadic. The last coded message had been vague, warning of increased scrutiny but providing no details. Cervantes had survived this long by trusting his instincts, and his instincts were screaming that something was wrong. He called a meeting with the other three generals using a method that prison officials still hadn't discovered. During recreation time in the yard, certain inmates would position themselves in specific formations. To guards, it looked like random clusters of prisoners talking. In reality, it was a visual code. The positions, the number of men in each group, even which direction they faced, all conveyed information. Within an hour, all four generals knew to expect a coded kite in their dinner trays that evening. The message was simple: increase security protocols, eliminate any loose ends, prepare for a possible raid. No names were mentioned, but everyone understood. If investigators were getting close, witnesses needed to disappear, evidence needed to be destroyed, and anyone who might cooperate needed to be reminded of the consequences that same day. Mendoza and Chen were working 18-hour shifts, cross-referencing financial records with prison visitor logs, phone records with murder dates, and building a timeline that showed the gang's operation with crystal clarity. They had identified 37 murders that could be directly linked to orders from the four generals. They had documented the money trail showing over $40 million laundered through front businesses, and they had wiretap recordings of Captain Delgado receiving instructions from Richard Stoltz, Cervantes' corrupted attorney. But they needed one more piece. They needed someone from inside the organization willing to testify, someone whose word would be unshakable in court. Chen had been working a potential witness for months, a former shot caller named Miguel Shadow Reyes, who had been excommunicated from the gang after questioning an order to kill a teenager. Reyes was currently in protective custody at a federal facility in Arizona. Hidden under an assumed name, Chen flew to Arizona and spent 6 hours with Reyes in a concrete room with no windows. He showed him everything they had, explained how close they were to bringing down the generals, and made a simple argument. Reyes could either spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, knowing the gang would eventually find him, or he could help end them and finally be free. Reyes was silent for a long time. Then he asked one question: "Can you guarantee my family will be protected?" Chen couldn't promise that, not honestly, but he could promise that if they didn't stop this organization now, nobody's family would ever be safe. Reyes signed the cooperation agreement. With Reyes' testimony, they had everything. Mendoza and Chen compiled a 300-page report with exhibits, witness statements, financial records, and wiretap transcripts. They made 5 copies, sealed them in tamper-proof packages, and personally delivered them to the U.S. Attorney's office in Sacramento. They requested an emergency meeting with the U.S. Attorney himself. Bypassing every normal protocol, the U.S. Attorney, a man named David Brennan, spent 12 straight hours reviewing the evidence with his top prosecutors. At 2 in the morning, he made the call. They would move forward with a massive coordinated operation. Simultaneous arrests of all 4 generals at Pelican Bay, Captain Delgado and 3 other corrupted correctional officers, Richard Stoltz and 4 other attorneys, and 73 street soldiers across California. It would be the largest gang takedown in state history. They called it Operation Broken Family. At 5 a.m. on a cold November morning, FBI tactical teams entered Pelican Bay State Prison under the cover of darkness. They moved with military precision, isolating each of the 4 generals in their cells before any communication could occur. David Cervantes was extracted from his cell still lying on his bunk. He didn't resist, didn't say a word. He just stared at the agents with those black ice eyes and smiled, as if he knew something they didn't. Single quotes T. Simultaneously, SWAT teams hit addresses across California. Front doors were breached, suspects were pulled from beds, and the entire network that had operated with impunity for over a decade came crashing down in a matter of hours. The arrests were so coordinated and so swift that the gang had no time to retaliate or eliminate evidence. Captain Frank Delgado was arrested in the prison parking lot as he arrived for his shift. When agents searched his home, they found over $200,000 in cash hidden in his garage, along with detailed records of every piece of information he had sold to the gang. He broke within hours of interrogation, confirming everything Mendoza and Chen had suspected and providing details about other corrupted officers they hadn't even identified. The trials took 2 years. Miguel Reyes testified for 11 days, walking the jury through the inner workings of the organization with devastating precision. Financial experts explained the money trail. Forensic analysts connected DNA evidence to multiple murders, and Mendoza took the stand for 3 days, walking through the investigation step by step, explaining how she had tracked the gang's evolution from for men in solitary confinement to a criminal empire that had terrorized an entire state. All four generals were convicted on multiple counts of racketeering, murder conspiracy, and continuing criminal enterprise. David D.C. Cervantes received 7 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The judge called him a criminal mastermind whose intelligence was matched only by his complete lack of humanity. Captain Delgado received 40 years for corruption and conspiracy to commit murder. Richard Stoltz was disbarred and sentenced to 25 years. 71 of the 73 street soldiers arrested were convicted, with sentences ranging from 15 years to life, but the story didn't end there. 6 months after the final convictions, Detective Sarah Mendoza was promoted to lieutenant and transferred to the FBI's Organized Crime Division. Agent Thomas Chen received a commendation and continued hunting criminal organizations with the same relentless focus he had brought to this case. Miguel Reyes and his family entered witness protection and disappeared into new lives under new names, and Pelican Bay State Prison implemented sweeping reforms, new communication monitoring systems, rotating staff assignments to prevent corruption, and enhanced security protocols designed to prevent another organization from ever gaining the same foothold. Mendoza's niece Sophia grew up never knowing how close she had come to becoming a victim. The photograph that had been used to threaten her aunt was locked in an evidence box, a reminder of what they had been fighting for all along. But late one night, almost a year after the final conviction, Mendoza received an anonymous email. No text, just an attachment. When she opened it, her blood ran cold. It was a photograph taken inside Pelican Bay, showing a group of young inmates in the yard, positioned in a specific formation that looked random but wasn't. She had studied those visual codes during the investigation. She knew what she was looking at. A new organization was forming. Different faces, same methods. The 4 generals might be in permanent solitary confinement, monitored 24 hours a day, but the system they had created, the blueprint for building power from behind bars, had survived them. Mendoza stared at the photograph for a long time. Then she forwarded it to Chen with a simple message: "We're not done yet." Because the truth about criminal organizations like Nuestra Familia is that they don't die when their leaders fall. They evolve, adapt, and rebuild. The war against them isn't won with a single operation, no matter how successful. It's won by people like Mendoza and Chen who understand that vigilance never ends, that the fight for justice is measured not in arrests and convictions, but in the daily choice to stand against evil even when evil threatens everything you love. The concrete walls of Pelican Bay still rise from the Northern California fog like a fortress built to contain the worst of humanity. And inside those walls, in the spaces between surveillance cameras and during the blind spots of guard rotations, someone is always planning, always organizing, always building the next empire from nothing but will and violence. The question isn't whether another organization will rise. The question is whether there will be people brave enough to stop it when it does.